The first light of an autumn morning spilled across the rolling hills of Victorian England, gilding ancient stone walls, whispering through towering oaks, and awakening the proud silhouette of Ashcombe Manor, a palace of carved limestone whose countless windows reflected both the brilliance of the rising sun and the darker secrets hidden behind polished glass. Those who admired its graceful towers believed wealth alone had built such magnificence, yet every brick had been laid upon generations of ambition, sacrifice, and carefully concealed sorrow, for noble houses often wore beauty the way actors wore velvet costumes, disguising wounds beneath exquisite embroidery. Within that celebrated estate lived Duke Adrian Ashcombe, the only surviving heir of one of England's oldest families, a man whose commanding stature, striking features, and effortless elegance inspired admiration wherever he appeared, though the warmth expected behind such handsome eyes had long ago surrendered to polished indifference. Society praised him as the perfect aristocrat because he danced flawlessly, hunted brilliantly, and carried himself with the confidence of inherited privilege. But those who served him understood another truth, one spoken only in kitchens and servants' corridors, that the Duke valued appearances more than affections, obedience more than honesty, and admiration more than love. Far from London's glittering drawing rooms stood Whitmore Hall, where faded wallpaper and cracked marble fireplaces quietly testified that noble blood alone could not protect a family from financial ruin. There lived Lady Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of an earl whose fortune had dissolved through failed investments and unfortunate harvests, leaving only dignity where prosperity had once flourished. Eleanor possessed neither dazzling jewels nor fashionable extravagance, yet she carried herself with effortless grace that no poverty could diminish. Her gentle brown eyes reflected uncommon patience, while every careful gesture revealed a woman taught that kindness required no audience and compassion needed no applause. Though many gentlemen overlooked her because she brought little dowry, servants adored her, village children trusted her, and widows blessed the quiet generosity that often emptied her own modest purse before filling another's empty cupboard. When creditors tightened their grip upon Whitmore Hall, Eleanor's father accepted an astonishing proposal from Ashcombe Manor. The marriage would rescue their family from disgrace while strengthening the Duke's political alliances, and every influential newspaper celebrated the arrangement as a fortunate union destined to become the season's greatest romance. Only the families themselves understood the painful silence surrounding those glowing announcements. Adrian had agreed because duty demanded it, not because affection stirred within him. His heart remained hopelessly devoted to Lady Vivian Blackwell, a breathtaking widow whose captivating smile concealed relentless ambition beneath polished charm. Vivian delighted in admiration as flowers welcomed sunlight, collecting wealthy admirers without surrendering genuine devotion to any of them. She believed herself born to rule Ashcombe beside Adrian and regarded Eleanor not as a rival deserving sympathy but as an inconvenient obstacle placed between herself and limitless privilege. The wedding filled St. Bartholomew's Cathedral with scented roses, shimmering candlelight, and the rustling silks of England's highest nobility. Choir voices rose beneath magnificent arches while stained glass scattered jeweled colors across polished stone, transforming sacred ground into something almost celestial. Eleanor entered wearing ivory satin that had belonged to her late mother, carefully restored despite years of careful storage, and every guest admired her quiet elegance even as whispers drifted through crowded pews predicting a loveless marriage. Adrian waited before the altar with flawless posture, every movement dignified, every expression perfectly restrained. When their vows were exchanged, Eleanor searched his face for the smallest hint of warmth, finding instead the distant composure one might offer a respected stranger. She answered with unwavering sincerity nonetheless, believing promises retained their value even when returned without equal tenderness. Evening settled softly across Ashcombe Manor as musicians performed graceful waltzes beneath crystal chandeliers, while noble guests toasted the newly married couple with sparkling champagne and rehearsed congratulations polished by generations of etiquette. Eleanor fulfilled every expectation placed upon a duchess, greeting elderly ladies with gentle courtesy, thanking distant cousins she barely recognized, and smiling despite the growing certainty that her husband considered her little more than another obligation inherited alongside his ancestral lands. Adrian scarcely remained beside her, disappearing repeatedly into crowded corridors where Vivian's brilliant laughter floated above every conversation like intoxicating perfume. Observant servants exchanged anxious glances, sensing dangerous currents beneath elegant celebrations, yet none dared question their master's choices. When the final carriage departed and silence embraced the sleeping estate, Eleanor climbed the grand staircase toward the magnificent bridal chamber prepared for their first night as husband and wife. Candles flickered beside fresh lilies, their sweet fragrance mingling with beeswax and polished cedar, while moonlight poured through tall windows, silvering embroidered curtains and untouched linen sheets. She paused beside the hearth, gathering quiet courage before the heavy oak door slowly opened behind her. Adrian entered without hesitation. Beside him walked Vivian, radiant in crimson silk, her victorious smile brighter than every candle within the room. The Duke calmly declared that the woman accompanying him was the only one he truly loved, and that nothing, including marriage, would change that truth. The words struck harder than any shouted cruelty because they arrived with perfect composure, surrender to the first pale promise of dawn, realizing the innocent bride who had entered Ashcombe Manor would never exist again. Every servant witnessing the scene lowered trembling eyes in helpless shame. Eleanor neither pleaded nor wept. She removed her white gloves, laid her bridal bouquet upon the marble mantel, thanked the frightened maid for her faithful service, and quietly dismissed everyone. Alone before the dying fire, she watched darkness. Morning arrived without celebration. Pale sunlight drifted through towering windows, touching the abandoned bridal bouquet whose white petals had already begun to curl at their edges, as though even flowers understood that beauty could wither beneath humiliation. Eleanor rose before the household awakened, dressed herself in a simple dove-gray gown, fastened her mother's modest pearl earrings, and quietly left the magnificent chamber that had never truly become hers. She did not seek Adrian, nor did she ask where Lady Vivian had spent the remainder of the night. Some questions she understood, only deepened wounds that dignity struggled to close. The servants watched her descend the marble staircase with cautious sympathy. They expected tears, accusations, perhaps even a dramatic departure for her father's diminished estate. Instead, the young Duchess greeted each maid and footman by name, thanked the cook for preparing breakfast, and smiled with remarkable gentleness despite the invisible ache resting upon her heart. Her composure unsettled the household more profoundly than any display of grief could have done, for quiet strength often carried greater weight than loud despair. Adrian appeared only briefly that morning, impeccably dressed for a hunting excursion with influential gentlemen visiting neighboring estates. He acknowledged Eleanor with a polite inclination of his head, as though greeting a distant acquaintance rather than the woman he had married scarcely hours before. Vivian stood beside him wearing an expensive emerald riding habit, radiating effortless confidence while accepting the admiring glances of assembled guests. Before departing, Adrian informed Eleanor that she was free to occupy whichever rooms pleased her, provided she did not interfere with his personal affairs. The words were delivered with courteous indifference, making them all the more painful. Eleanor answered with a graceful nod. She neither defended herself nor demanded respect. The carriage rolled away beneath iron gates, carrying Adrian and Vivian into the brilliant countryside while whispers lingered like fading echoes across the manor's entrance hall. Once silence returned, Eleanor looked upward toward the soaring ceilings and realized that an estate of such breathtaking grandeur could also feel astonishingly empty. Rather than remaining inside luxurious chambers that reminded her of rejection, she wandered through forgotten corridors where dust-softened carved banisters and portraits faded beneath years of neglect. Ashcombe Manor revealed another face beyond its polished salons. Entire wings stood unused, their fireplaces cold, their wallpaper peeling, their windows clouded by neglect. Furniture lay beneath linen sheets, forgotten clocks had long since stopped ticking, and gardens visible through cracked glass had surrendered to tangled ivy and thorny roses. It seemed impossible that one of England's greatest estates had been permitted to decay in such silence. An elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Hawthorne eventually found Eleanor examining a neglected nursery overlooking the eastern gardens. Expecting criticism for the neglected condition of the rooms, the elderly woman apologized repeatedly. Eleanor gently interrupted her, asking instead why repairs had never been completed. Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated before explaining that the Duke considered those sections unnecessary expenses. Funds were reserved for London's entertainments, prestigious horse races, elaborate dinners, and endless renovations to the manor's public reception halls, where distinguished visitors formed their opinions. The explanation lingered painfully within Eleanor's thoughts. She asked to see the estate offices, surprising the housekeeper, who had never known a duchess interested in account books rather than ballroom invitations. Inside a modest chamber lined with towering ledgers, Eleanor discovered shelves overflowing with financial records, unpaid invoices, neglected correspondence, and petitions from tenant families awaiting decisions that had remained unanswered for months. Dust coated many unopened documents, suggesting they had been ignored long before her arrival. She spent the afternoon reading quietly beside a sunlit window. The elegant handwriting of estate clerks gradually revealed troubling patterns. Farms produced less each year because irrigation channels had collapsed. Village cottages required urgent repairs after harsh winters. Skilled craftsmen had abandoned Ashcombe lands seeking fairer wages elsewhere. Several trusted overseers repeatedly requested funds for essential improvements, yet approvals never arrived. Meanwhile, lavish expenditures upon imported wines, exotic furnishings, and extravagant social gatherings increased relentlessly across every season. None of these discoveries inspired anger alone. They awakened purpose. Eleanor recognized suffering hidden beneath polished aristocratic appearances, and unlike many privileged ladies educated merely to entertain distinguished guests, she had spent childhood walking among struggling tenants whose hardships resembled these forgotten reports. Compassion transformed uncertainty into quiet determination. Over the following days she established an unassuming routine. Every morning she visited different corners of the estate accompanied only by Mrs. Hawthorne and occasionally the stable master's cheerful grandson, who eagerly pointed toward damaged bridges, neglected orchards, and abandoned workshops once famous throughout the county. She listened more than she spoke. Farmers cautiously described failing harvests. Mothers worried about leaking roofs before winter arrived. Elderly servants remembered prosperous years when Ashcombe had inspired gratitude instead of resignation. News of the Duchess's visits spread quickly through surrounding villages. At first, many assumed her kindness merely performed another aristocratic tradition destined to disappear after several polite appearances. Yet Eleanor returned again and again, remembering names, asking thoughtful questions, and carrying notebooks filled with careful observations instead of empty promises. Trust, slowly earned, began replacing suspicion. When Adrian finally returned from nearly a week of celebrations, he scarcely noticed the subtle changes unfolding around him. Servants smiled more readily. Hallways echoed with renewed industry as forgotten rooms were cleaned. Gardeners cautiously resumed neglected work after Eleanor convinced them that beauty deserved preservation even before permission officially arrived. Adrian dismissed these differences as harmless diversions occupying his neglected wife. That evening, while reviewing another stack of neglected estate correspondence beneath lamplight, Eleanor unfolded a brittle envelope hidden inside an aging ledger. Its faded wax seal bore the unmistakable crest of the late Duke Adrian's father. The enclosed document referenced a confidential inheritance agreement secured decades earlier and instructed that its complete contents remain concealed until extraordinary circumstances threatened Ashcombe itself. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened as she carefully reached for the remaining sealed pages waiting beneath the false bottom of the ancient wooden cabinet. Eleanor remained motionless for several heartbeats, her fingertips resting lightly upon the hidden compartment as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile certainty that she had uncovered something extraordinary. The aged cabinet exhaled the faint scent of cedar and forgotten paper, while the single oil lamp upon the desk painted trembling shadows across shelves crowded with dusty ledgers. She slowly lifted the remaining sealed packet from its concealed resting place, noticing that the crimson wax still carried the unmistakable imprint of the Ashcombe crest, untouched despite the passing years. Mrs. Hawthorne entered quietly with a tray of tea, only to stop at the sight of the unopened documents resting before the Duchess. Recognition widened the elderly housekeeper's eyes. She whispered that she had seen the late Duke place those papers inside the cabinet many years earlier, instructing that no one disturb them unless the future of Ashcombe itself stood in genuine peril. He had spoken with unusual gravity that evening, dismissing every servant before locking the study himself. Until that moment, Mrs. Hawthorne had believed the compartment empty. Eleanor thanked her gently but chose not to break the seals immediately. She understood that some truths demanded witnesses worthy of them. The following morning she traveled quietly by carriage to the village where Mr. Edwin Holloway, Ashcombe's retired family solicitor, spent his peaceful retirement surrounded by overflowing books and carefully tended roses. Age had bent his shoulders without diminishing the sharp intelligence shining within his silver eyes. When Eleanor placed the sealed packet upon his writing desk, the elderly gentleman removed his spectacles, stared silently at the crest, and drew a slow, astonished breath. With respectful care, Holloway opened each document while Eleanor watched in attentive silence. The first pages contained correspondence written by the late Duke during the final years of his life. Every line revealed a father burdened by painful foresight rather than bitterness. He praised Adrian's intelligence and courage but confessed deep concern regarding his son's growing vanity, reckless spending, and inability to distinguish admiration from genuine loyalty. He feared that inherited privilege, if left unchecked, would eventually consume the estate generations had sacrificed to preserve. Additional papers outlined an intricate legal arrangement prepared with Parliament's approval and witnessed by distinguished judges whose signatures remained perfectly preserved beneath fading ink. Should any future duke neglect Ashcombe to such an extent that the lands, finances, or tenants suffered measurable decline, the lawful Duchess would assume legal stewardship if she successfully restored prosperity through wisdom and faithful management. Ownership of the estate's principal holdings would temporarily pass into her authority until the family legacy stood secure once more. It was not a punishment designed to disgrace an heir but a safeguard created to protect thousands whose livelihoods depended upon responsible leadership. Eleanor listened without triumph. Instead, sorrow settled quietly within her heart. The late Duke had loved his son enough to prepare for his possible failure, an act requiring painful honesty rather than cold judgment. She folded the letters carefully and asked Holloway whether the agreement remained enforceable after so many years. The solicitor answered without hesitation. Every requirement had been drafted with exceptional precision. If the evidence demonstrated prolonged neglect alongside measurable restoration achieved through the Duchess's actions, the law would recognize her claim beyond reasonable dispute. During the weeks that followed, Eleanor devoted herself even more completely to Ashcombe's recovery. She avoided gossip and concealed the documents within a secure lockbox entrusted to Holloway's protection. Instead of preparing legal challenges, she focused upon work deserving no applause. Empty workshops reopened beneath experienced craftsmen. Abandoned orchards filled with newly planted saplings. Roofs across tenant cottages were repaired before winter storms arrived. Children gathered inside a converted schoolroom where retired tutors once again taught reading, arithmetic, and history beneath bright windows overlooking blooming gardens. Every improvement quietly strengthened the very conditions described within the forgotten inheritance agreement. Meanwhile, Adrian remained captivated by London's endless entertainments. Lavish masquerade balls, fashionable horse races, glittering musicales, and expensive private dinners consumed his attention. Vivian accompanied him everywhere, dressed in silks imported from Paris, delighting in compliments while encouraging every extravagant purchase that elevated her own reputation. Newspapers praised the Duke's dazzling social calendar even as discreet financial warnings accumulated unanswered upon his neglected writing desk. Yet society possessed remarkably sharp instincts beneath its polished manners. Distinguished guests visiting Ashcombe increasingly remarked upon subtle changes throughout the estate. The gardens flourished with renewed elegance. Servants carried themselves with restored pride. Village markets overflowed with fresh produce bearing the Ashcombe crest. Visitors spoke warmly of the Duchess's kindness, describing her as a woman whose quiet presence accomplished more than endless displays of aristocratic grandeur. Admiration spread naturally because it rested upon visible deeds rather than carefully orchestrated appearances. Vivian noticed the shifting conversations before Adrian did. Invitations once addressed solely to the Duke now included personal requests for the Duchess's attendance. Ladies who had previously ignored Eleanor began seeking her company, while influential gentlemen praised the remarkable improvements transforming Ashcombe's lands. Every compliment directed toward Eleanor diminished the admiration Vivian considered rightfully hers. Jealousy gradually replaced confidence. Unable to tolerate Eleanor's growing esteem, Vivian secretly instructed one of Adrian's loyal servants to search the estate offices for correspondence explaining the Duchess's unexpected authority over financial decisions. Days later, the frightened servant returned with only fragments copied from old memoranda referencing unusual legal provisions connected to the late Duke's final wishes. Though incomplete, the clues proved enough. Vivian sensed that some hidden force threatened everything she expected to inherit beside Adrian. She confronted the Duke that evening inside the manor's magnificent music room, where candlelight shimmered across polished mahogany and crystal mirrors reflected anxious expressions from every angle. Speaking with calculated urgency, she insisted Eleanor had manipulated elderly servants, interfered with estate affairs, and perhaps even fabricated documents to undermine his rightful position. Adrian initially dismissed such suspicions as impossible, yet uncertainty entered his thoughts for the first time. Pride disliked unanswered questions almost as much as it feared losing control. The following morning, Eleanor received an elegant invitation summoning her to London's grand charity gala hosted by the nation's most influential aristocratic families. The note appeared courteous, bearing Adrian's signature in flawless handwriting, but something about its sudden warmth felt strangely unfamiliar. As she folded the invitation, Holloway quietly warned that powerful people rarely arranged magnificent gatherings without expecting equally magnificent confrontations. Eleanor gazed through the carriage window toward distant Ashcombe Manor, sensing that the quiet work of rebuilding lives had finally awakened forces determined to destroy everything she had patiently restored. The journey to London unfolded beneath low silver clouds that drifted across the autumn sky like silent witnesses gathering for an unseen reckoning. Eleanor sat quietly inside the carriage, her gloved hands resting upon the small leather case that contained nothing more than a notebook and several ordinary estate records. The inheritance documents remained safely with Mr. Holloway, for she believed truth deserved protection until the proper moment demanded its voice. Beyond the windows, villages slipped into broad fields, and broad fields surrendered to bustling roads crowded with merchants, noble carriages, and laborers whose lives continued regardless of the private tragedies carried by those passing among them. By twilight the capital shimmered with impossible splendor. Gas lamps painted golden ribbons across rain-darkened streets while magnificent townhouses glowed behind polished windows. Elegant ladies stepped from gleaming coaches in gowns embroidered with pearls and silver thread, their laughter mingling with the distant rhythm of horses upon cobblestones. Gentlemen in tailored evening coats exchanged confident smiles beneath towering marble columns, each believing reputation to be the strongest currency in England. Eleanor entered the grand hall wearing a simple ivory silk gown adorned only with her mother's pearls. She carried no extravagant jewels, yet quiet dignity surrounded her more brilliantly than diamonds ever could. Conversations softened as she crossed the ballroom. Many who had pitied her after the wedding now greeted her with sincere admiration. They had heard stories of restored tenant farms, repaired cottages, flourishing gardens, and schools reopened across Ashcombe lands. The Duchess, who had once seemed merely unfortunate, had quietly become respected throughout the county. Eleanor accepted every compliment with gentle humility, never claiming achievements as her own, always praising the loyalty of servants and the determination of hard-working tenants instead. Across the ballroom, Vivian observed every exchange with growing unease. She had expected Eleanor to disappear into forgotten corners of society, not become its newest subject of admiration. Each gracious greeting directed toward the Duchess felt like another candle extinguishing the brilliance Vivian believed belonged solely to herself. She smiled beautifully for those watching, yet beneath that polished expression resentment tightened steadily around her heart. Adrian finally approached Eleanor beneath an enormous crystal chandelier whose countless prisms scattered light across the polished floor like fragments of frozen stars. His expression remained composed, but uncertainty lingered behind his confident posture. He remarked upon the favorable reports surrounding Ashcombe and casually questioned how his wife had managed such remarkable improvements within only a few short weeks. Eleanor answered honestly, explaining that she had simply listened to those who already understood the estate better than anyone else. Farmers knew their fields. Craftsmen understood their workshops. Loyal servants remembered what Ashcombe had once been. Leadership, she quietly observed, often began by hearing voices long ignored. Her calm reply unsettled Adrian more deeply than criticism would have done. Before he could continue, Vivian gracefully interrupted, wrapping one elegant hand around his arm while directing a charming smile toward Eleanor. With perfectly measured sweetness, she suggested that the Duchess possessed remarkable talent for creating impressive stories from ordinary household maintenance. Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing the concealed insult beneath her polished words. Eleanor met Vivian's gaze without hostility. She simply replied that lasting results rarely required dramatic stories because healthy fields, repaired homes, and grateful families eventually spoke for themselves. A brief silence settled across the gathering. Even those previously entertained by aristocratic gossip recognized the quiet strength hidden within Eleanor's restraint. The evening's charity auction began beneath the direction of Lord Pembroke, an elderly nobleman whose influence extended through Parliament, the courts, and England's oldest families. During his welcoming remarks, he unexpectedly praised Ashcombe's remarkable recovery, citing reports from county officials describing improvements that had reversed years of decline. He invited Eleanor to stand before the assembled guests in recognition of her extraordinary stewardship. Warm applause echoed through the ballroom. Adrian remained seated. Vivian's smile vanished. As Eleanor acknowledged the unexpected honor, several distinguished gentlemen approached Adrian with respectful curiosity. They inquired whether the estate's impressive transformation represented a new management philosophy or whether the Duchess had assumed greater responsibility than previously understood. Their questions appeared innocent, yet each quietly suggested that Ashcombe's renewed reputation belonged increasingly to Eleanor rather than its hereditary duke. Pride, carefully polished over an entire lifetime, began to fracture beneath invisible pressure. Adrian suddenly realized that conversations throughout the room no longer celebrated his fashionable parties or expensive entertainments. They celebrated his wife. Unable to suppress growing suspicion, he requested a private conversation with Eleanor inside an adjoining library lined with ancient volumes and portraits of Ashcombe ancestors. Once the heavy doors closed behind them, courtesy gave way to restrained confrontation. Adrian demanded to know why influential figures increasingly credited Eleanor for accomplishments that should naturally belong to the Duke. He questioned her growing authority among servants, her involvement in financial matters, and the unusual confidence displayed by estate officials whenever her name arose. Eleanor neither raised her voice nor retreated. She explained that she had sought no authority beyond caring for neglected responsibilities abandoned by everyone else. Every repaired roof, every restored workshop, every answered petition had simply required someone willing to notice what others overlooked. She reminded Adrian that she had never acted against Ashcombe. She had acted for it. Before Adrian could respond, the library doors opened unexpectedly. Mr. Holloway entered accompanied by Lord Pembroke and two senior King's Council barristers whose distinguished reputations commanded immediate respect throughout the kingdom. Their expressions were solemn rather than hostile. Holloway bowed courteously before producing the sealed inheritance documents. The room fell perfectly silent. He informed the Duke that circumstances now required the formal presentation of his late father's confidential legal provisions concerning stewardship of the Ashcombe estate. Every signature, witness, and parliamentary seal had already been independently authenticated that very afternoon at the request of Lord Pembroke after confidential inquiries regarding the manor's remarkable restoration. Adrian accepted the documents with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor. As candlelight flickered across fading ink, he read his father's unmistakable handwriting describing the precise conditions under which Ashcombe's control could legally pass into the hands of its lawful Duchess. Each sentence stripped away another layer of certainty. Each page revealed that Eleanor's quiet labor had fulfilled obligations he had scarcely known existed. Vivian stared in disbelief. Eleanor closed her eyes for one brief moment, not in triumph but in sorrow. Then Holloway spoke the final words that changed everything. "Your Grace," he said softly, "by sunrise the law will determine whether Ashcombe belongs to the man who inherited its title, or the woman who saved its soul." Dawn arrived beneath a sky washed in pale gold, yet no warmth reached the chamber where the fate of Ashcombe rested upon a weathered bundle of papers written by a father who had loved his family enough to prepare for its greatest weakness. Adrian stood beside the library window without speaking, reading each page again as though repeated examination might somehow alter the careful handwriting that carried his late father's unmistakable authority. Every sentence stripped away another illusion he had built around himself. He had always believed inheritance was secured by birth alone, never imagining that character could one day outweigh blood. By mid-morning, the principal judges appointed to review the inheritance agreement gathered within the Ashcombe estate rather than a crowded public courtroom, honoring the late Duke's request that family dignity be preserved whenever possible. Lord Pembroke presided beside two senior King's Counsel, while Mr. Holloway presented decades of carefully preserved evidence. Ledgers documented years of neglected maintenance. Petitions from tenant families revealed unanswered pleas for assistance. Estate accounts exposed enormous sums spent upon lavish entertainments while bridges collapsed, workshops closed, and village cottages deteriorated. Then came another collection of records. Receipts bearing Eleanor's signature demonstrated how abandoned orchards had been restored, leaking roofs repaired, schools reopened, and wages paid to craftsmen who had nearly abandoned Ashcombe forever. Letters from grateful tenants spoke not of miracles, but of simple acts of attention that had returned hope to forgotten lives. Farmers described harvests rescued because irrigation channels finally flowed again. Widows wrote that their children had survived winter because the Duchess repaired homes no one else remembered. Servants testified that she had never once acted for personal glory, only for the estate entrusted to her care. Every witness deepened the silence surrounding Adrian. He listened as people he scarcely recognized described the woman he had married. Mrs. Hawthorne recalled Eleanor personally carrying blankets through freezing rain to elderly villagers before the household even knew she had left the manor. The stable master spoke of her selling unnecessary silver ornaments to purchase seed for struggling farmers rather than demanding higher rents. The village schoolmaster described children reading beside bright windows because the Duchess had restored classrooms abandoned for years. None of these people exaggerated. Their quiet sincerity carried greater power than dramatic speeches ever could. At last Adrian was invited to answer. For several moments he remained motionless. The proud confidence that had once defined every gesture had vanished, replaced by painful honesty. He admitted that he had neglected the estate while chasing admiration that disappeared as quickly as applause after a ballroom performance. He confessed that he had mistaken vanity for strength and luxury for leadership. Most difficult of all, he acknowledged before every witness that he had humiliated an innocent woman on the very night she became his wife, believing compassion to be weakness and loyalty something guaranteed rather than earned. No one interrupted him. Truth required no applause. Vivian, seated near the rear of the chamber, suddenly rose with visible agitation. Refusing to accept defeat, she accused Eleanor of carefully manipulating servants to manufacture affection while secretly plotting to seize Ashcombe from its rightful duke. Her voice echoed sharply across the room, but desperation had replaced elegance. She demanded that Adrian reject every accusation and denounced the inheritance agreement as deception. Instead, Adrian slowly turned toward her. For the first time since Eleanor had entered his life, he saw Vivian without the dazzling illusion that had blinded him for years. Every conversation now returned to him with painful clarity. Every extravagant purchase she had encouraged. Every responsibility she had dismissed. Every flattering word spoken whenever wealth surrounded them. He realized she had loved the grandeur of Ashcombe far more faithfully than she had ever loved the man who inherited it. His reply was quiet. "There has been enough dishonor." The words struck Vivian harder than any shouted condemnation. She searched his face for hesitation and found none. Without another sentence, she gathered her silken skirts and walked from the chamber, her footsteps fading along marble corridors that no longer promised the future she had imagined. By the time the great entrance doors closed behind her, the woman who had once captivated London's highest society had disappeared from Ashcombe forever. The judges withdrew briefly before returning with their unanimous decision. The inheritance agreement was authentic. Every legal condition had been fulfilled exactly as written. The estate had suffered prolonged neglect under Adrian's stewardship. The lawful Duchess had demonstrably restored its prosperity through wisdom, faithful administration, and personal devotion. Therefore, under the authority granted by the late Duke's binding settlement, Eleanor Whitmore Ashcombe became the legal controller of the Ashcombe estates, financial holdings, and governing authority until such time as the family legacy stood permanently secured. The announcement transformed the room. Not because anyone celebrated Adrian's loss, but because justice had quietly reached the destination patience had prepared for it. Adrian bowed his head. Eleanor remained perfectly still. She felt no triumph. Victory purchased through another person's failure carried little joy. When the proceedings concluded, every official respectfully departed, leaving husband and wife alone within the vast library where their marriage had truly begun to change. Adrian approached slowly. "I cannot ask forgiveness," he said, his voice unsteady for the first time. "A man who brought another woman into his wedding chamber surrendered the right to expect mercy. I see that now. I believed power belonged to me because I inherited it. You have shown me it belongs to those willing to protect others." Eleanor regarded him with calm eyes no longer clouded by fear. "You cannot rewrite yesterday," she answered softly. "Neither can I. No. But tomorrow remains unwritten." Those words carried neither promise nor rejection. Only possibility. Weeks passed. Under Eleanor's leadership Ashcombe flourished beyond anything even the late Duke had imagined. Harvests filled overflowing granaries. Skilled artisans returned to reopened workshops. Tenant families celebrated festivals beneath restored village squares. Servants who had once worked beneath silent despair now carried genuine pride. Prosperity spread not through extravagance but through fairness, discipline, and compassion. Adrian did not attempt grand gestures. Instead, he worked quietly beside estate managers, visited farms he had ignored for years, learned the names of children who greeted him without fear, and accepted correction whenever experience proved Eleanor wiser than himself. Respect returned slowly, never demanded, always earned. One spring morning, nearly a year after their disastrous wedding night, Eleanor stood upon the eastern terrace watching sunlight spill across gardens once consumed by neglect. Adrian joined her without speaking. Together they observed workers laughing among blossoming orchards while children raced along pathways lined with newly planted roses. Finally Eleanor reached into her pocket and withdrew the heavy ring of estate keys that symbolized Ashcombe's authority. She placed them gently into Adrian's hands. "They are not a reward," she said. "They are a responsibility. Keep them only if you remember what they truly open." Tears filled his eyes. "I will." She smiled for the first time without sadness shadowing it. As the morning bells echoed across the valley, Ashcombe Manor no longer belonged to pride, betrayal, or empty titles. It belonged to a woman whose dignity had survived humiliation, a man transformed by painful truth, and a future built not upon inherited privilege but upon earned honor. For in the end, the greatest inheritance was never the estate itself. It was the courage to become worthy of calling it home.